Hello, good evening, everybody. Hello. This event is hybrid, so those of you at home will get at some point the full experience of the in-person evening that we're having here. Thank you so much to everyone that's come along tonight, and we've got, I think, 96 people signed in to join us from home. So I'll just try not to think that I'm talking to 120 people at any one time, which would be quite overwhelming. Should be a really interesting night tonight. Delighted to have Graham talking in a moment. I'll just give a little snapshot. This event's been delivered by the Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership Scheme, working in partnership with Dumfries Archival Mapping Project. And I think if any of you don't know about Dumfries Archival Mapping Project, please do look them up on Facebook, and particular mention to Archie Mccurley that holds it together with such aplomb through the year. We have no fire alarms scheduled this evening, and so if a fire alarm goes off, we've got the door behind us. For those of you at home, it'll depend on the layout of your house precisely where the best way out is, but obviously just I'll let you handle that directly. We've got a presentation from Graham. It's going to take about 50 minutes, and then we've got ability for questions after that. So questions will be displayed here on the laser display board here to my right, and they'll be handed forward at any point. So we can take questions whether from in the audience or at home. So I think without further ado, if I can hand over to you, Graham, you've got a rather interesting presentation you're going to give us tonight, and you're happy for me to throw the odd question in as and when suits, you said?
Yes, I am indeed. Yeah,
Brilliant.
It will stop the flow, which is probably a good thing. Thanks, McNab. Now, first of all, I'm going to make a complaint. Because in my biographical details that were issued with this talk, it said that I'm a DIY enthusiast. That could hardly be further from the truth. I am an unwilling DIY incompetent. So if anybody wants anything fixed, I'm not the man to do it. Now let's get on with the talk then. So thanks very much for coming tonight and for listening. And we'll see if I can keep you listening or not. It's unlikely, but this is going to be a bit of a gallop because I had a practice go at this a couple of times, and keeping it down to 50 minutes is going to be a struggle. So I'm just going to get on and charge at it, if that's okay with you. Now, I'll start by saying that about a month ago, Francis Wilkins gave a talk on David Curry of New Law, which was also in this same series of events. And he, as you might remember if you watched it, was made his money out of the slave trade and out of smuggling. And this is going to tangentially touch on the slave trade, not really about smuggling, but it sort of is a follow-on from Francis's talk, because I'm looking at how sources of new money came into the area and what happened, a little bit about what happened to the estates that these new people had bought. So that's really what I'm looking at tonight. It's not a scientific look. I'm not saying this is what happened all over Galloway, although it would be great to know, but that's really what we're aiming at finding out tonight. Now, one of the books that's very helpful for this is The History of Lands and Their Owners by Peter Mccurley, which was written in the 1870s, but is still a great source, if a little bit unreliable, for telling you who owned which properties in Galloway when. And there's a lot of gaps in it, and there's some mistakes in it, but it's dead useful. I'll refer back to that a few times while I'm talking tonight as well. In Francis's talk, and in this, and in the first statistical account that the ministers wrote for the different parishes in this area, there's a lot of mentions of the collapse of the Douglas Heron Bank, otherwise known as the Eyre Bank, which was in 1769. And Curry of New Law was one of the ones who fell victim to that collapse and went bankrupt as a result. That put a big spanner in the works for local landowners to make the improvements that they wanted to make to the estates, because this was just the time of the big series of agricultural improvements that were coming into the area. So where did any new money come from if the people locally were unwilling to risk big investments or simply didn't have the money? Patrick Heron, a writer from this area, described a case of this when he was talking about the Carling Walk Canal that was built again in the 1760s, and that was an investment by the people whose name I forgot, the Gordons. And the Gordons spent this a lot of money on the Carling Walk Canal, but then they wanted to extend that and improve the whole Lough Ken area, and so they could get marl easily up to farms further north to help with fertility and make a packet of money, and also take a canal right down to the at Palnackie. So do a big improvement. And Heron was saying, nobody wants to spend this money because they're too stung by the bank collapse and by other events at the time. So we're going to look a bit at that. Right. What I'm going to do tonight then is look at the three estates as mentioned. Those are the Maybe estate, just south of Dumfries, the Daneville estate, just near Crossmichael, and the Forbes estate, the Earlston estate, etc., a bit further north, just beyond Dalry. And I'm going to particularly look at three individuals, the stories of three individuals associated with those estates. Right, so we've got here a slide of the estate of Maybe. We're going to look at this first and in a bit of detail. This will be the biggest bit we're going to do. So here's a map from 1790 on the right. I won't show you the detail of it. You'll see little bits of detail from it later. This was when the estate was still owned by the Maxwells of Mccurley, the neighbouring landowners, big landowners. And so they've got that. You can see from the bit in the middle that the contents of the estate, it's around about 500 acres. And the bottom left bit shows a map, a modern map, an aerial image with the estate greyed out on it. And that is from the wonderful National Library of Scotland. I always say the website, the National Library of Scotland, is amazing. Well, so it is. The maps bit is just incredible. And this map has been geo-referenced. And if you want to know how that works, have a look at the Maybe map in the estate plans under Cucubershire on that website, and you'll see it's fantastic. So there it is. Now, the reason I'm looking at this estate in a bit of detail is because the Ewart Library hold the archives for this estate, or at least part of the archives for this estate, is the part that relates to the Howard family. And it's the Howards I'm going to talk about, in particular, Richard Howard. There he is, appearing on this disposition in 1804. His father, Robert Howard, was a wright. In fact, he was a wheelwright in Traquair, in the village of Bridgend, which became Maxwelton later. Bridgend, a notoriously lawless place in the 18th century. I'm sure Robert Howard was a very law-abiding man, but whether he was or not, he certainly left a little bit of property. It says at the bottom here, to the said Richard Howard, my son, all and whole my 3 acres of land, or thereby which formerly lay Runrig, with the lands belonging to Archibald Malcolm and William Vere, and is now laid into an enclosure by itself in Gallow Hill, Gallow Hill is just sort of on the Dalbeattie Road going out of Dumfries before you get to Cargan Bridge. So he had a bit of land, a little bit, and he had a couple of properties in Bridgend as well. So a small amount of money he'd made, presumably in an honest way, from being a wheelwright. Now, that made me look back at lands and their owners to see what they said about Richard Howard in the Maybe estate. And what Mccurley says about Richard Howard is who Richard Howard was, whom he married, and when he died, we have obtained no information. Well, that sort of piqued my curiosity. So, and we had the archive. So that is the kind of farm cart that Robert Howard might have been building. Carts were a bit of an innovation actually in the 18th century. In the early 18th century, there were very few carts about in Dumfries and Galloway because the state of the roads was appalling and they were expensive things to build, and mostly sleds were used instead of carts. And this, of course, as you'll know, is Maybe House. So the question is, how did the son of a wheelwright, presumably trained in that way, come to own this estate and build this house, which is what he did. There's the estate in 1790 close up. That's just the bit around what became Maybe House. And as you can see, it's just a small farmsteading with a couple of other small buildings nearby and quite a bit of woodland around. If we move on to the Ordnance Survey Map of 1850, you can see a formal planned estate with a big house, that's Maybe House, a steading, which is quite an impressive steading for those people who know it, sort of on classical lines, a walled garden, a carriage drive, the whole works, very smart. So a lot of money's been put into this. Where did it come from? Well, the first clue was in a bundle of bank statements, and this is one of them. Howitt's account with Messrs. Palmer and Company, Calcutta. That's the crucial bit, 30th of April, 1823. So I thought, right, what's Calcutta got to do with Richard Howitt? So eventually it got into my head, took a while, to look up trades directories for Calcutta and Bengal in the 1780s, 90s, that sort of period, because Howitt, we know, got seisin of the estate, of the Maybe estate, in 1804. So at some point before that, we know he was back and was living there from then on. So if I say one or two other things about this account, it shows a balance, you won't be able to see this, but it shows a balance of about £9,000. Now, 9,000, then, if you look, there's all sorts of different ways of calculating money value. Roughly from this period, you're talking about a factor of 100. So that's about £900,000. But in my opinion, it might be worth a lot more than that if you're buying property, because property, especially large properties, were cheap in comparison with the necessities of life in those days. So we'll have a look a bit more at that later. Let's carry on. So in this directory, the East India Calendar or Asiatic Register for 1792, Richard Howitt is listed, thank goodness. And it shows that he came over to India. It very handily tells you this. In 1781, it even tells you which ship he came over on, which was the East India Company's Rochford. And the Rochford was a 781-ton ship, which is pretty big for those times. They were doing trips around the world in 300-ton ships. So a 781-ton ship is a big ship, might have looked a bit like this. And it conducted 4 voyages between 1770 and 1783. It also tells you that Richard Howitt was a carpenter. Not surprising, because after all, that's what his father was, essentially. So let's have a look at Calcutta. This is a little bit later, Calcutta in 1830. But Calcutta, when Howitt got there, was a pretty amazing place. This, by the way, is William Dalrymple's book, The Anarchy, about the relentless rise of the East India Company. If you haven't read any of Dalrymple's books on India, I would heartily suggest that they are fantastic. This particular one is probably the best of the bunch that I've seen so far. And in it, he says, in 1786, Calcutta itself had turned into a boom town with a population of around 400,000, more than double that at the time of Plassey. That was 1757, which is not that long before it. Now known as the City of Palaces, or the St. Petersburg of the East to its British inhabitants, and the Paradise of Nations, Zanat al-Bilad, to the old Mughal aristocracy, the company's bridgehead in Bengal was unquestionably the richest, largest and most elegant colonial city in the East. Imagine everything that is glorious in nature combined with everything that is beautiful in architecture, wrote the newly arrived William Hunter, and you can faintly picture to yourself what Calcutta is. Now, I don't want to talk down Bridgend, which I'm sure was a lovely place, but it might have been quite a shock for a 19-year-old to arrive in Calcutta in 1781 to that. this was also the time of the incredible growth of the British influence, or the East India Company's influence in India. And it culminated when Marquis of Wellesley was sent out as Governor General in 1798 and pretty well conquered the whole of the rest of the peninsula of India by 1803, which, as Dalrymple said, that's bigger, that's more than what Napoleon did in Europe, and to a bigger population. Scary stuff, actually. Now, what would Richard Howard have found to do in Calcutta? Well, we know that he was a carpenter, and in this Calcutta City of Palaces, which is a British Library publication from the 90s, looking at all things Calcutta. That's a fantastic book, actually. I bought this specially, I'll have you know, because I was giving this talk. Just to mention that, when I come to claim my expenses. It says, a lady who's just arrived in 1778, Mrs. Kindersley, says furniture is exorbitantly dear and so very difficult to procure that one seldom sees a room where all the chairs and couches are of one sort. People of the first consequence are forced to pick them up as they come, either from the captains of Europe ships or from China, having some made by the blundering carpenters of the country, or send for them to Bombay, where they are generally received about 3 years after they are bespoke, so that those people who have great good luck generally get their houses tolerably well equipped by the time they are quitting them to return to England. Not a happy woman, but you can see there was an opening there for a carpenter. And indeed, that was probably what he started off doing. But what he finished doing was making carriages. This is a bit later again, but this is the kind of posh, expensive carriage. It's like a wheelwright on speed, if you like. So he's gone up in the world. In the 1803 directory, he is described as a coachmaker. So he's definitely advanced. And this was the last directory he was in because, of course, he came back that same year to England. To Scotland, rather. So there's that's the kind of thing he was doing. Now, this account that with bank statement we were looking at earlier was John Palmer with Palmer and Company. Palmer and Company was John Palmer, and John Palmer ran the biggest, as it was called, agency house in Calcutta, and therefore the biggest agency house in India. Agency houses were the middlemen for the East India Company. All the trade of the East India Company, which meant all the international trade that was going, and a lot of the internal trade as well, had to go through agency houses. So the people who ran them became extremely rich. And this was John Palmer's house in the Lal Bazaar, that one there, which was just about the biggest house in Calcutta at the time, the City of Palaces. And Palmer, we know, because we've got letters from him, one of which we'll look at in a minute, was well acquainted with Richard Howard. Now, that just wouldn't have happened in this country. Socially, they were poles apart. Palmer was the son of a lieutenant general who was Warren Hastings. Warren Hastings was the Governor General, Warren Hastings' military secretary. So they moved in completely different circles. But here was Palmer dealing with Howard. Howard's house was just around the corner, off to the right here, down a street called Cossitalla Street, which is where the English merchants often lived, and the trade was done. Now, in 1830, I'll just read you this bit first about Palmer, so you get an idea of what an incredibly wealthy man he was. He was the leader of that circle, that's of the agency houses, and was called the Prince of Merchants from his unbounded liberality, amiability, and wealth. He had married a very handsome woman of an Armenian cast of countenance by the name of Hampton. His house was always open, and a dinner table for nearly 20 always spread and nearly always filled. No stranger arrived then in Calcutta without dining there as a thing of course. I found that the firm possessed 16 ships actively employed to all parts of the world, particularly to Mauritius, China, America, Java, Sydney, and the Cape of Good Hope, besides the regular trading to England and back, etc., etc. A book was written about Palmer about 10 years ago, and it just was, the title was just The Richest Man in India. So that's where he sat. But in 1830, his firm went bankrupt. And this page we're looking at here, the creditors pro forma, was sent to Richard Howett, and it says a creditor of the late firm of Messrs. Palmer and Company of Calcutta. And it's for that creditor to fill in to see if they do or do not want to make a claim on the company, as was. Now, here is a letter from Palmer. You get the right bit here. A letter from Palmer printed, basically asking for help, basically saying to Richard Howett and to a lot of other creditors, no doubt, will you agree to forego your claim? Because then I can become an insolvent debtor and I won't be in complete poverty. This from the richest man in India. And he also writes on the back a personal appeal to Richard Howett, which I shall read to you. I cannot forward this application without adding my special appeal to your generous consideration. However brought about, my misfortunes are signal and overwhelming, and in the decline of life, though still possessing sufficient faculty of mind and body for labour, I am left to resume my struggles for subsistence. But my wants are few, and my views so circumscribed that, if I have preserved any estimation in the world, its influence may be conducive to your own advantage. So he's trying to say, you know, I might be able to still do a bit for you. Here, just give me some money, for goodness sake. So that's 1831. And this is Howett's very interesting reply. It's interesting in several ways. And I'll read bits of this. So I'll just go straight on to the next slide, which that's just the letter. And this is the letter with a bit highlighted for you to see a bit more easily. So what Howett says on the 8th of February, 1832, gentlemen, he's sending this to his lawyers in Dumfries, Primrose and Gordon, who of course are still going. And what he says is, when I sent you the power of attorney for Messrs. Cockerell and Company of Calcutta, so in other words, he's saying all my dealings with my existing agent in Calcutta, Cockerell, because Palmer's gone defunct, I informed them that I left the whole concern of Messrs. Palmer and Company of Calcutta to you. I have received a circular a few days ago, that's the one we've just seen, which rather surprised me, which was to give up the whole of my claim, £18,454 4 and 4pence. He's got it exact. If I was to do so, it would be like a drop in the ocean, such are Palmer's losses. From the friendship I have for Mr. Palmer, so obviously they were quite close, and if the creditors all agree to make a general sweep, in other words, give up their claims too, mine shall be nearly so. In other words, he will consider giving up his claim as well. The interesting after that says, the old woman must now be nearly 67. Now, in Palmer's account, by the way, he's 70 at the time. In Palmer's account, there's a payment of £30 a month for a pensioner. This is the pensioner who, without making too big, bold a leap, was probably his Indian mistress in Calcutta. It's funny, you know, when he got back, he immediately married into quite a wealthy lady over here, but that's nothing to do with it. Anyway, nearly 67 years of age. And he goes on saying the purchase of an annuity of £30 a month for the remainder of her life will not cost Messrs. Palmer and trustees very much, and will allow the old woman to remain in the house. And he goes, oh, I won't read the rest of it, but he's basically agreeing to give the house to Messrs. Palmer and Company as well when the time comes. So he's willing to do some stuff for his old friend Palmer, who presumably helped him out a lot as an extremely wealthy man years before when he was setting up in business, but only so much. And this is the Cockerell we've just been talking about. This is Howett's account with him, showing that just in 1834, he had nearly £50,000 in dividends. You won't be able to see that on this faded thing, but that is a considerable amount of money. So we're talking at the very least 5 million, and probably more, in addition to the estate he's already bought. So he was doing all right, thank you. Now, we nearly reached the end of Mr. Howat. I'm going to very quickly mention Thomas Watling. He's a bonus tonight. You get a free bonus. There's 4 people I'm going to talk about, but he only gets a very brief mention. He's a fascinating character. I don't know if you've come across him. A lot of people in Dumfries in particular know about him. He was convicted for forgery in 1789, forging banknotes. That was a capital offence. He was lucky to escape hanging, transported to Botany Bay, and he was a professional artist, so he became the first recorder in image of the inhabitants and the flora and fauna and the new settlement at Botany Bay. And over 500 drawings and paintings were made by him, which form what the Australians call the art of the First Fleet, which is very important to them, and that was Watling. In 1797, he got a full pardon and went to Calcutta. And when he was in Calcutta, he was listed from 1801 till 1803 as a miniaturist, a portrait miniaturist, which absolutely ties up with what he did. What did he do in the intervening before, when he got there in 1797 to 1801? My contention is that he probably worked for Richard Howat. They were exactly the same age. They could well have been related through Howat's sister's marriage. I've got to find that out yet, but I think that's possibly true. And they came back to Scotland in the same year, at the same time. There's a bit more to it than that. I haven't got time tonight, but it's a great story. Watling came back, became the drawing master at the new Dumfries Academy for a year, and then started forging again. For some weird reason, he wasn't found guilty. It was not proven. It was not proven. The verdict. How he got away with it, I don't know. And the last we hear of him, he'd gone to London and was ill and wrote to the old Governor General of the old settlement in Botany Bay to say, can you help me with some money? I'm dying, basically. And that's the last we know. So that's Watling. Anyway, yeah, that's just a bit of his life. Tom Powell, the poet, who I'm sure you'll know, wrote a book about him called A Wild Adventure about 10 years ago, well worth reading. It's a poetry book, that's great stuff. Right, Howat died in 1834. I better move this on a bit. And here's the first page of the minute book of his trustees. He left a pretty complex set of arrangements when he died, money being given to all sorts of different people. Interestingly, on the right is a list of invitees to his funeral. Every single local landowner who's known about is on that list. So he'd become an accepted member of society.
I see there's a Laurie mentioned there.
There is
yes.
Not just any Laurie. That is Sir Robert Laurie, Baronet from Maxwellton. He's the top of the family. So I'm glad to say that I put him in. Don't worry, I'm going to say some nasty things about Lauries in a minute. Not really. Not really. As well, a couple of the people on here, John Moran of Carreel and the Reverend Charles Maitland Babington, they were both investors in the local area as well, in Dumfriesshire, and they got their money from the slave trade. Interestingly, there's a big story to tell about as well. Another person who was at the funeral was the Reverend Dr. Henry Duncan. So there we go. So that you're doing well to get in there. And Francis Short, who was the big fixer in Dumfries, the town clerk, so that they all came to his funeral. There's another page of invitees, which I'm not showing you. Wine, I've always got to put a bit about wine in. So the wine that Richard Howat bought is on the left in the last year of his life, including, he must have thought he was going to live a long time because he ordered half a pipe of port, which is several hundred bottles, for £42, and spent altogether £50 on wine and spirits in the last year of his life. And on the right-hand side is the inventory of wine he had in the house at his death, £116, 2/3 of which went to Mr. R.K. Howat and 1/3 to Richard Howat's widow. R.K. Howat was the chap who succeeded to the estate. I'm just going to say a little bit about him. He was a customs officer on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls at a place called Chippewa. And he had to decide whether or not he wanted to inherit the estate. Well, he wanted to inherit the estate, but whether or not to be an absentee landlord or come back and live on the estate. And it was a hard decision. And he decided eventually that he would come back. I probably won't be able to find the bit now. There we are. Here it is. So I'm just going to read you the first little bit of the letter where he says he's coming back. This is in early 1835. And he's writing again to Primrose and Gordon solicitors. Dear Gordon, I am now in possession of all your letters up to the 22nd of March, and what has been going on at Maybe, I have been aware of from more quarters than one. Slightly pointed. Since I left you, I have had a heavy dispensation of divine providence in the loss of my two youngest daughters, all from the effects of scarlet fever. Indeed, Mrs. H and myself, with the remaining part of our family, will embark for England as soon as possible. We want a change from the melancholy scene we have suffered this winter. So that's why Howitt came back to manage the estates. What kind of a job did he do? Well, first of all, he had all Richard Howitt's money to spend. And so what he did was put an advert in the local paper, the Dumfries Courier, in 1835 to say, look, I've got £45,000 to spend. Does anybody want to sell me their estate? And a whole lot of people queued up. Here's two of them. The Youngs of Lincluden and, sorry, this is a different one. They were thinking of buying the Lincluden estate from the Youngs at one point, but the price wasn't right. Richard Howitt was actually thinking of buying it, and then Robert Kirkpatrick Howitt, who's his nephew, decided that he wouldn't do it. Two other local landowners, again, this is Young trying to sell a neighbouring estate of Gilly Hill, which he didn't manage to do. He didn't want that either. And even people as far away as the Rins of Galloway. Here's the McDowells of Garthland trying to sell their lands to Howitt, Robert Howitt. But what Robert Howitt decided to do eventually was buy the Barncailey estate, just near Kirkpatrick, Durham, which was 7 farms at the time. So he bought that. Maybe was about 6 farms. And he also bought 3 other parts of estates adjacent to Maybe, part of Currachan, part of, he bought Nethertown, which is an adjacent farm, and his father, his uncle Richard has also left him 7 different properties in Bridgend, including Palmerston, where Queen of the South now is. So he was doing well. But he got the estate to prosper more. These are the Maybe sawmill account books from the 1830s to the 1860s. Fascinating reading, if you get a chance. They were selling pit props and they were selling railway sleepers and transporting them from New Abbey down to Runcorn, amongst other places. And there's the sawmill that he built. Well, that's not the sawmill he built, actually. That's just a sawmill I've got a section of. And you can see this is the sawmill that existed, a little tiny one in 1790. There it is. And then by 1850, it was like an industrial complex. Several buildings, new sawmill, 2 different mill dams to drive it, and another one up here with another mill lead coming down here, and another mill dam here to drive the farmers' machinery. So he'd invested a lot in that period, had Robert. And just in case you've never seen a rabbit book before, there is one. Right, so we're now going to go on.
I have a question.
Oh, right, go on then. Yes, not really.
Seamlessly cut in.
Yeah.
A question from Jackie Williams, one of our online viewers. Was it well known at the time that Calcutta was a boom town?
Oh, yes, it was known through especially in Britain. I mean, because that was the emblem of the British Empire. Even though it was the East India Company, the government were getting more and more influence over the East India Company throughout the 18th century, and it was a British Empire thing. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your question, Jackie. And do in the room, do put your hand up at any point if you've got a question. But back to you, Graham. Thanks.
Right, that's fine. Right. we're going to go on to the second estate because I can see time's running short already. So here we go. The Daneville Park Estate. So this is a plan of the estate in 1834. Let me whiz through these quickly. Otherwise, I haven't got my place. Here we go. So where is it? This is the River Ken. That's now Loch Ken on the left-hand side. That is now the dam at Glenlocha, where the hydro is. And Daneville Park is here, and Glenlocha House is here. So, and that's the estate. It's a similar size estate to the one at Maybe, about 500 acres. We'll have a little look at that. Well, there's the house front. Now, let me say a little bit about the family that bought this estate in 1789. So the chap who bought the estate was Walter Sloane Lorry of Redcastle. Now, Redcastle is Hochever, and the Lorry Arms is in Hochever. That's no accident. But Walter Sloane Lorry had also inherited the Woodhall estate, which is where Lauriston now is, named after one of his, I think is probably about his grandfather. And he also owned plantations in Jamaica, also called the Woodhall estate. So some of his money was definitely coming from those plantations, and he was doing very well, thank you. A little bit about him personally. I should have asked, I was going to ask somebody before I started, who had a proper local, I should have asked you, Mr. Nelson, who had a proper local accent to read a couple of short Burns pieces for me, because Burns wrote about Walter Sloane Lorry in the election ballads, the Heron election ballads. So I'm just going to have to read them myself, and pardon me, you know, for reading them in an English accent. But we winna mention Redcastle, the body, e'en let him escape. He'd venture the gallows for Scylla, and twirn at the cost of the rape. That's the rope. So in other words, Burns considered him a greedy man, and the reason they'll let him escape was because he was also a tiny man. And apparently once the landlady in a pub couldn't find him to get him to settle the bill because he was so small. The other election ballad that Burns wrote about him was, and there Redcastle drew his sword that ne'er was stained with gore, save on a wanderer lame and blind to drive him for his door. So he's trying to make out that he's both greedy and not willing to get into conflict. That first bit comes from apparently the Battle of Bunkers Hill in 1775, because he was in the army. And so that's the start of the American Revolutionary War. And apparently he fled the battlefield. And small boys used to chase him round, shouting, Bunkers Hill at him for the rest of his life. So he must have had a miserable time, really. But he was also a wealthy man. So that's Walter Sloane Lorry. Now, he was the man who in 1789 bought the Crofts estate, which became the Daneville estate. And within 5 years, he built this house, Daneville Park. So and that's where he went to live. So this was the house that he settled in. He lived for a few more years. Let's have a little look at the size of the estate. Again, it's just about 500 acres, fairly small, just these few farms, not that large, but a nice addition and in a lovely setting. I mentioned Glenlocha House, so it had two houses, two gentlemen's houses, if you like, on the estate, Glenlocha, the smaller one. Right, now, got to say a bit about the inheritance after Walter Sloane Lorry, because it was very complicated, and I'm going to simplify it because we haven't got time. He had two illegitimate sons, first of all, William Bailey Sloane Lorry, who inherited the Woodhall estate in Scotland, and Walter Sloane Lorry, who inherited the Woodhall estate in Jamaica. But he also had three sisters, and two of those were childless. They didn't marry. The third one married James Donald, a merchant, and it was his grandson, James Donald, who at the age of 19 inherited the Daneville estate. Now, it's a pretty dangerous thing for most 19-year-old men to inherit money and land. And I'm afraid we're going to tell a sad tale over the next few slides. So this is the state of rents when Donald inherited, James Donald. Again, they're about what they were. Daneville at that time was rented out, but James Donald went to live in it. But there were legal problems right from the start. Walter Sloane Lorry, like I say, had tied up everything in a very complex way. And one of the things he did was allow that James Donald's aunt, Margaret, would receive £2,000 out of his estate. And he didn't want to pay her. And she lived with her husband, George Jones, on the Brooklands estate, just near Crockett Ford. So, and they were in legal arguments for the next 13 years as to whether they should get this money or not. In the end, they did get the money. Gambling, or the interior of modern hell. Now, I say that he was too young a man really to receive a lot of wealth. Now, my very good former colleague, Kathy Gibb, was the lady who catalogued this archive collection. So you can also see this in the Ewart Library, the Donald of Crofts collection, GGD 631, if you're that keen. I know somebody in the audience might be. This estate, this chap, James Donald, we've got evidence of him in his papers having gambled, having taken trips to France specifically to go gambling in Paris, spending lots of money on drink, for instance, paying for a dinner in Kirkcudbright for 33 people with 16 bottles of port, 15 bottles of Madeira, and 34 bottles of claret, along with smaller amounts of brandy, porter, whiskey, and ale. And they had to pay for a lot of broken glasses at the end of the evening. That was in 1819, just after he inherited. He was evidently still socializing in 1833, hiring a coach to Edinburgh and having it wait 4 hours until 2 o'clock in the morning when he finished carousing. So he had a pretty lively time. He also spent a lot of money on furnishings for the, let me get the right bit here, furnishings on interior decoration, for instance. He went to the place, Trotters in Edinburgh. They made the finest furniture, the best interior decorators of their time, and he was buying Brussels carpeting, best silk papers, gold molding, bedroom furniture, that kind of thing from them. And he also had a pretty active social life, as you can imagine. He was a member of the Kirkcudbright Yeomanry, which the gentry tended to join. It was like the militia for people with horses. And fashion as well. A pair of the finest blue cloth Cossack trousers, a Newmarket coat with gilt fox buttons, a black cashmere vest from Drummond & Son, Edinburgh, in contrast to the suit of clothes for his servant boy, which was made in Castle Douglas for 5 shillings. So he was having a good old time. Let's carry on. But to fund this sort of lifestyle, he had to get money. And in between 1824 and 26, he took out 3 loans, totaling £11,000, huge amount of money. This one's for 4,500 from some bankers. So he was spending his inheritance. Oops. His mother was also in debt, and he actually relinquished we're getting problems here. He actually relinquished his rights to her estate because he was worried about the debts he might get. She lived in Castle Street in Dumfries, sorry about this. And there's Castle Street. And we're going back again. And here's his father's unclaimed prize money. His father was in the military, and they conquered some islands in the West Indies, which formerly belonged to Denmark, and he received prize money of £81, which Donald obviously thought it wasn't worth claiming because it was such a paltry amount of money. So that went to the to the Chelsea pensioners, Chelsea Royal Hospital. And now, all this meant that by 1834, he had to sell up. So he had to sell Daneville Park. And on the reverse of that original plan we saw, it's not a normal estate plan, it's actually a sale plan. And this is saying for sale, the lovely mansion, etc., of Daneville Park, built 30 years, in lovely situation, etc., go and buy it. So he had to sell up, very sadly. And there's the price he got for it, £16,000 in 1835. He sold it to some Edinburgh lawyers. By this time, he had so many debts that he only had £750 of that 16,000 left after he paid off his debts. So he went to live in Edinburgh. Sorry about this. He went to live in Edinburgh at a house in Newington, sorry, and his great aunt owned property still in Edinburgh, but by this time his health was so poor that he couldn't afford to take advantage of the £2,500 that she'd left him as a result of the sale of her 5 large flats in Edinburgh. Don't know why it's doing this. Oh, let's try that. Thank you. Oh, you might be right. Oh, he's a genius, this man. Yeah, thank you. We're back on track. Right, so Daneville Park, £16,000, hardly paid off his debt, went to live in Edinburgh. He was in bad health by this time. Got a little bit about his health here. In 1834, one of his friends was already writing to him saying he was repelled to think of you so much an invalid, but hoping better days are in store. What was he suffering from? Well, what would you expect? Gout, amongst other things. Let's carry on. That's his great aunt's property. We've seen that. And finally, the cost of his doctor's visits. He died in early 1838 at the age of 38. He'd had nearly 100 doctor's visits. There's 44 there, but if you take it back a bit, he'd had nearly 100 doctor's visits to dress his gouty leg. Often found him in a very irritable frame of mind. There's a gout sufferer who's also suffering from the DTs at about this period. There were an awful lot of them around at that time. So that sadly was the end of Donald. And it provides a contrast where, yes, new money's come in with the lorries, they're buying this estate. Donald does do a little bit with the estate for the first few years, but it's basically a story of decline. And then another family comes in and buys it again from outside. So it's a contrast to the first one. Now we're going to finish off, and I'm sorry this is so speedy, but otherwise I'm going to ruin them. Right, last few minutes, and this is going to be quite brief. It's on the Forbes of Calendar estates that are down here in this part of the world. And I'm specifically going to talk about William Forbes of Calendar. This is a much, much bigger estate on a much bigger scale than the other 2 little ones we've looked at to date. It had 10 times the value of the Crofts estate at the same period. And it covered, even though it was a hill estate, most of the land was hill land, not as valuable, but it covered from Dumfriesshire over here, right through the Glen Kens and almost to the Ayrshire border adjoining Wigtonshire. So this bit here is not far from Loch Doon, and this bit down here, you're getting towards Money Ive. So that's the extent of the estate. So who was William Forbes? Well, here he is painted by Sir Henry Raeburn. So you can tell he's a man of means if he's going to be painted by Sir Henry Raeburn for a start, because only the top people got painted by him. William Forbes was born in 1743. I've got out of me thingies again. Here we are. Born in 1743 in a family of Aberdeen coppersmiths. His grandfather was a coppersmith, so was his father, so were his brothers. But he and his brothers were also men of considerable business acumen. And when opportunities came, They seized it, and they seized one of the biggest opportunities to make money in the 18th century in Scotland, in fact, in Britain. And that opportunity, there we go, was tied up with ships. Because in 1761, the Royal Navy started copper bottoming its ships. Wasn't very successful at the start because they had all sorts of problems with the bolts and corrosion and things like that. But in 1778, because of the American Revolutionary War, they decided to copper bottom pretty well all their ships, all at once. And by 1782, only 4 years later, 82 capital ships, that's ships of the line, 74 gunners and above, 115 frigates and 102 sloops and cutters had been copper bottomed. That's around about 300 ships. This ship, HMS Victory, it took 3,923 sheets of copper to copper bottom it. That's just one ship. A 74-gun ship, much smaller than this, cost £1,500 to sheath at that time. So it was a vast amount of money going on. And what happened was Forbes did a deal. There's a copper bottom ship, that's the Cutty Sark, that's quite a recent copper bottoming, they've restored it. He did a deal with, oh, just a minute, with a chap called Thomas Williams. Now, Thomas Williams was a Welsh solicitor from the Isle of Anglesey, and he was in charge, he got in charge of the largest copper mine in the world at the time, which was Paris Mountain in North Anglesey. And Paris Mountain isn't a mountain anymore. In fact, it never really was. It was only a hill, but it was almost totally made of copper, as they found out, and right just below the surface. That copper was the source of Forbes's fortune because Williams mined it and Forbes carried out all the Royal Navy contracts on the ships. So he has been called more recently the first billionaire in Britain, but you know, that's probably exaggerating a bit, but that was the equivalent maybe to what he was. So what did he do with his money? Let's get on to that, because we're nearly finished now. He bought the Callender House estate to start with, and the Linlithgow estate. The story is, and it is only a rumour, that he was the first person ever to use a £100,000 banknote to buy those two estates together. I think that might be true. Then, in only 3 years later, that was 1783. So all this happened in an incredibly short space of time. Between 1778 and 1783, he bought this estate out of almost nothing. And then in 1786, he bought the Earlston Estate and all the lands down here over the next few years. He wasn't universally popular, especially around the Falkirk area. He was seen as a bit high-handed. And this is Copper Bottom's retreat. So there's Forbes running away, thinking that the mob has set fire to his house, whereas in fact, it's just the Carron works, the ironworks at the Carron glowing in the dark. So that's what they'd like to think happened to William Forbes. But we'll pass over that lightly. Here is the Earlston Estate in the 1760s. Now, Forbes bought an estate that was in a good condition because a lot of the credit for the improvement of the estate had to go down to a chap called John Newell of Barskirch. It was he who had got the land lined, got the marl up from Carling Walk at Castle Douglas through the canal and got everything improved. So when Forbes bought it in 1786, he had a good going concern. He extended the estate as well, as you saw, all the way to Dumfriesshire by buying other bits. And he also bought other estates in Ayrshire, the Sanker estate near Ayr, he bought that. This was part of the huge survey that Forbes commissioned in 1800, just showing the bit around Earlston itself. Absolutely beautiful maps. Have a look at them on the survey, please do, on the National Library of Scotland website under estate maps. They're well worth looking at just for their beauty. So He'd already increased the amount of woodland locally. By 1850, his successors had increased it further. And of course, the Forbes still own the Earlston Estate today. So that's definitely been a success story in that way, the family continuing to own that land. They also sold Callender House in Falkirk. That's as it looks roughly today. They sold that in the 1960s, but again, they still own a lot of the land around there in the Falkirk area. If you ever go to Callender House, I don't know if you've ever been there, it's the weirdest approach because you approach it through some 1960s high-rise blocks. And then suddenly you're in the park. It's most odd. Anyway, that's Callender House. And I think I'm just about done. So I'm sorry about the speed and I'm sorry that I've run on, but I'm finishing off now. And I'd just like to say acknowledgements. I've said about Kathy Gibb already. I'd like to thank the Hewitt Library for permission to do all those archive pictures. I knew it would be an archive heavy talk because I do archive heavy talks. I'm sorry about that as well. It's all apologies really. And the map images are reduced from the National Library of Scotland, as I mentioned about. And thanks also to Dumfries Museum. And thank you lot for listening and putting up with me. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Brilliant. We've had some questions come into the audience. I'll let anyone put their hands up if they've got questions in the room. But if you're sitting comfortably, I'll
as comfortable as I can be. Go
on. A question from Hazel Armstrong. Who was the architect of Daneville Park House and does it still stand?
We don't know who the architect was. I checked the Buildings of Scotland and it says unknown. So that is one to find out. So it could be, that'll be an interesting search because it was it's a proper classical building.
You made a throwaway comment at one point about Glenlocker House. Well, the current resident of Glenlocker House is in our online audience, Graham, tonight. So I have lived at Glenlocker House since May 2021. I've been trying to find out about the house, not as straightforward as it seems, because it was rented as part of the bigger estate.
Yes.
And I've been told the house was built in 1793 before Daneville House, but I can find no reference of it. Built. It was originally called Glenlocker Lodge. Do you have any suggestions? It's quite interesting to use this as a broader question for you with your background. Do you have any suggestions about how I can go about searching more information about the house?
Well, one possibility is looking at the Sazins, because the Sazins are documents of land transfer, and often a building was built rather after it was been bought by somebody. So if you know roughly the time it was built and you see that the land was bought by somebody at that time, and especially then that the valuation of the land suddenly increases, then you will think that's probably when the house was built. You might be lucky and actually find architectural plans and things like that, but the further you go back, the more difficult that is. And
how do you make that approach? Where is that?
Well, there's a whole load of places that might be at. It could be in what was the Royal Commission in Edinburgh, which is now Historic Environment Scotland. They've got a huge collection of architectural plans. So I say we as was in the Hewitt Library have something like, we don't know how many plans we've got. We might have 100,000. So that there's
two potential outcomes there.
Yeah,
great question, Caroline. Thanks so much for bringing that in. And a question here about, do you know of a date when maybe house was built?
Well, it's got to be pretty soon after how it came back. So the first 10 years of the 19th century. Cool.
Any questions in the room? We have a roving mic.
Question about, you said that many of these people brought money from overseas in the early 1800s. Was land cheap after the Napoleonic Wars when the price of beef went down? And was there a slump in the 1820s so that land was comparatively cheap?
I don't know enough about the comparative values of land in the different periods, but certainly this is the 1830s I was looking at for all the lands that Robert Howitt might buy, and the prices then struck me as pretty low compared to about 30 years before in 1800. So it could be that they hadn't recovered from the 1820s, but that is supposition. But when you think that in the late 18th century, for instance, the Swinton estate was sold for £5,000. Then land values had not gone down since then. They'd certainly gone up, and I think that any drop would have been outweighed by the perceived value that everybody knew could be got from improvement, where rents had shot up between the 1760s and say 1800, and were continuing to shoot up with land improvements. So there was so much improvement. Normally land was valued by a certain number of years of rental value. So 24 years, 30 years, 40 years, whatever it happened to be. And that was much more important than anything that might be happening internationally.
Brilliant. Thank you. I was thinking something very similar, Sandy, when you said early on about why large properties were so cheap at that time. It's just so stark to today with spiking house price and land price.
It is
so fascinating.
A good example was, I haven't had time to say it, but when we were looking at those Edinburgh houses that were owned by James Donald's great aunt in the 1830s, she was selling, one of the properties she was selling was a flat on Hope Street, which is just off Charlotte Square, 3-bedroom double upper flat, as it would now be called, and that was worth £500. Well, now it would probably be worth £500,000. So that's 1,000 times increase, not 100 times increase, which we were saying might be the multiplier.
Yeah, how it changes everything. Any more questions in the room?
Nick?
Oh, yes.
I'm particularly interested in the Fullerton family from Ayrshire, and they apparently made lots of money in Para and Calcutta and led to the village of Patna being built.
That's answered a question for me, thank you.
To what extent do you think, we often think that money has come from slavery and from the Americas to southwest Scotland. To what extent do you think the money from India had changed how things looked in southwest Scotland?
All references in Lands and Their Owners to people having worked in India and then coming back and buying estates than to anywhere else. And when you going back to the Burns's election ballads, the Heron stuff, he's talking about the nabobs returning. This is what it's all about. So absolutely right. I think it's probably the biggest source of money of the lot. After all, it was the wealthiest place, India. So, and whatever you think about the East India Company, and if you read this book, you don't think much of the East India Company, then they were brilliant at extracting money from India. They were superb at it. They've been doing it for a long time.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone who's joined us here in Balmaclellan. Thanks everyone dialing in from home. If you keep an eye on the Galloway Glens social media channels, we've got a range of events planned over coming weeks. But I suppose just to round off, thank you so much to Graham Roberts for giving us that presentation. Really interesting. Thank you so much.